Joy Cooper's hand trembled as she placed a steaming mug of coffee in front of a regular customer, the rich aroma of roasted beans fighting the greasy smell of the grill. Inside the diner, the morning rush hummed with the familiar clatter of heavy ceramic plates and the low, rhythmic drone of neighborhood gossip. For Joy, this bustling routine was usually a sanctuary, a place where she was just a nursing student working a double shift, not a woman living in a shadow of fear. But today, the air felt heavy, like the static before a thunderstorm. Her skin prickled with an instinctive dread that made her pulse thrum against her ribs. Through the large front window, she saw him. Mike. He was striding across the asphalt parking lot, his uneven, heavy gait signaling trouble long before he reached the door. Joy's stomach lurched. He wasn't supposed to be here. After the last time he'd cornered her, the manager had made it clear he was banned. But as Mike shoved the door open with enough force to make the glass rattle in its frame, it was obvious he didn't care about rules. The bell above the door didn't jingle, it shrieked. The hum of the diner died instantly. A few patrons looked up from their eggs, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths. Joy forced a breath into her tight chest, praying he would just sit down, praying he wouldn't make a scene in the one place she felt like herself. Joy, Mike barked, his voice loud and already thick with the slurring edge of morning whiskey. He approached the counter with a hunched, aggressive swagger, the sour scent of last night's binge trailing behind him like a physical weight. Heat flooded Joy's cheeks as every eye in the room pinned her to the spot. She was no longer a waitress or a student, she was the girl with the volatile husband. She mustered a tight, professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mike, you shouldn't be here," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper as she leaned over the counter. "I'm in the middle of a shift. Please, just go." He ignored her plea, leaning in close until she could see the broken red veins in his eyes. "Came to see my wife." "Since when is that a crime?" his voice carried across the silent room. "I asked you to leave," Joy replied, her voice trembling but firm. Her heart was thudding so hard it felt like it might bruise her ribs from the inside. This was her private nightmare, spilling out onto the checkered floor for everyone to witness. Mike's expression darkened, the simulated playfulness vanishing. "Don't you start with me," he growled. His hand shot out across the laminate counter, his fingers locking onto her forearm like a rusted vice. Joy sucked in a sharp breath as pain jolted up her arm. "Mike, let go. You're hurting me." "Hurting you," he sneered, his grip tightening until her skin turned a ghostly white. He yanked her forward, pulling her halfway over the counter. A stack of clean saucers rattled dangerously, and a half-filled cup of water toppled, shattering against the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. A child in a nearby booth let out a small, sharp gasp of fright. "You don't know what hurt is yet," Mike hissed, his face inches from hers. The thread hung in the air, sharp and jagged as the broken porcelain at their feet. Out of the corner of her eye, Joy saw the manager reaching for the wall-mounted phone, his face pale. But before he could dial, a new sound cut through the tension, the slow, deliberate folding of a newspaper from the back corner booth. "That's enough." The voice was cool, level, and possessed a quiet authority that seemed to drop the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. Joy's breath caught. She knew that voice. It belonged to Bobby Ronald, the quiet regular who sat in the same booth every morning, always impeccably dressed in charcoal suits that cost more than Joy made in a year. Bobby rose from his seat with a measured grace, adjusting the cuff of his shirt as he stepped into the light. He didn't look like a man about to start a fight, he looked like a man who had already won one. As he walked toward the counter, the intensity of his gaze fixed on Mike was so predatory that even Mike's drunken bravado seemed to flicker. "The lady asked you to leave," Bobby said, his tone almost gentle, yet underlined with a terrifying edge of steel. You should do as she says. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to subscribe to our channel if you love deep love stories, slow burn romance, and emotional connections that stay with you long after the story ends. By subscribing, you're joining a growing community of listeners who come here to relax, feel, and escape into unforgettable romance. Now, get comfortable, relax your mind, and enjoy the rest of the story. The air in the diner felt electric, everyone bracing for the moment the predator met something higher on the food chain. Joy watched, her arm still trapped in Mike's bruising grip, as her quietest customer stepped out of the shadows and into her world. The silence in the diner was absolute, heavy enough to make the air feel hard to breathe. Mike's hand remained clamped around Joy's arm, but his focus shifted. He looked at Bobby Ronald, then let out a sharp, jagged laugh that smelled of stale spirits. He saw a man in an expensive suit, someone who looked like he spent his days in air-conditioned offices, not in the trenches of a street fight. "This ain't your business, pal," Mike spat, his voice cracking with a mix of defiance and the first tremors of uncertainty. "She's my wife. Get back to your coffee before you get hurt." Bobby didn't blink. He didn't even look angry. He simply continued his approach, his footsteps silent on the linoleum. There was a terrifying stillness in his posture, the kind of calm found in the eye of a hurricane. When he reached the counter, he didn't grab Mike. He simply stood close enough for Mike to see his own reflection in Bobby's polished sunglasses. "I don't like to repeat myself," Bobby said. His voice was a cool, deadly drawl, vibrating with an authority that wasn't earned through volume, but through the absolute certainty of violence. "Let her go. Now." Mike's fingers tightened instinctively, causing Joy to let out a small, pained whimper. That sound seemed to be the trigger. In a movement so fast the eye could barely track it, Bobby's hand shot forward. He didn't punch, he gripped Mike's wrist with a precision that suggested he knew exactly which nerves to crush. Mike let out a strangled yelp, his fingers forced open by the sheer pressure of Bobby's hold. Joy pulled her arm back, stumbling away from the counter, her skin already blossoming with the angry red marks of Mike's fingers. She watched, wide-eyed, as Mike tried to swing his free hand. Bobby moved with the grace of a dancer, stepping inside the arc of the punch and placing a hand on Mike's chest. It looked like a gentle push, but Mike flew backward, his boots skidding across the floor until he hit a heavy wooden table with a dull thud. "You're dead!" Mike screamed, scrambling to his feet, his face twisted in a mask of drunken rage. "Do you know who I am? I've got friends in this town. I've got brothers on the force." Just then, the siren's wails cut through the air, growing louder until two police cruisers pulled up onto the curb outside. Joy felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. Charlie, the manager, hurried to the door as two officers burst in, their hands on their holsters. "What's the problem here?" the older officer started, his eyes scanning the room. They landed on Mike, then shifted to Bobby Ronald. Joy expected the officers to tackle the man who had just thrown her husband across the room. Instead, she watched a transformation take place. The older officer's posture went from aggressive to almost submissive in a heartbeat. He recognized Bobby. More than that, he seemed to fear him. The officer's eyes widened, and he took a half-step back, his hand dropping away from his belt. "Mr. Ronald," the officer said, his voice suddenly hushed, devoid of its previous bravado. "We didn't know, we were just responding to a disturbance call." Mike, sensing an opening, pointed a shaking finger at Bobby. "He assaulted me. You saw it. Arrest him." The officer didn't even look at Mike. He kept his eyes on Bobby, waiting for a signal. Bobby reached into his inner jacket pocket, and the air in the room spiked with tension. He pulled out a silk handkerchief and casually wiped a stray drop of spilled coffee from his sleeve. "The disturbance is leaving," Bobby said, his gaze never leaving the officer. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. "And he won't be returning to this diner, or to his wife's place of work. Do we understand each other, officer?" "Perfectly, sir," the officer replied. He turned to Mike, his expression hardening into one of disgust. "Move it, Mike. You're coming with us for a night in the drunk tank. And if I see you within a block of this place again, I'll make sure you regret it." Joy watched in stunned silence as the police, the men she had prayed would protect her for months, literally hauled Mike out of the door, treating him like a nuisance they were eager to dispose of to please a more powerful master. Mike's protests died away as he was shoved into the back of a cruiser. The diner remained silent for a long moment after the sirens faded. Bobby turned back to the counter, his expression softening just a fraction as he looked at Joy. He reached out, his hand hovering near her bruised arm before he pulled it back, respecting her space. "You should put some ice on that, Joy," he said softly. Joy looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the expensive suit and the calm demeanor. For the first time, she realized that her quiet, generous regular wasn't just a businessman. He was something much more dangerous, someone who moved the world with a whisper while others had to scream. A chill that had nothing to do with Mike ran down her spine. She was safe for now, but she had just seen the shadow of a much larger power. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Bobby gave a single, curt nod. "I'll see you tomorrow, Joy." He turned and walked out, leaving the diner in a state of stunned disbelief, and leaving Joy to wonder exactly what kind of man she had just been saved by. The following 3 days were a fragile illusion of peace. Joy moved through her shifts at the diner like a ghost, her eyes constantly darting toward the door, half expecting Mike to burst through or Bobby to materialize from the shadows. Bobby hadn't returned since the incident, but the manager mentioned that the diner's back taxes had miraculously been settled by an anonymous donor. Joy knew who it was. She felt his presence in the quiet security of the street and the way the local beat cops now lingered near the entrance during her closing shifts. But Bobby's protection had limits. It couldn't follow her inside the thin, peeling walls of her third-floor walk-up apartment. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the hallway of her building bathed in a flickering, sickly yellow light. Joy fumbled with her keys, her heart performing a nervous dance against her ribs. She just wanted to lock the door, soak her aching arm in warm water, and look over her nursing textbooks. She stepped inside, the click of the lock usually providing a sense of finality. "You really thought a guy in a suit was gonna save you forever?" The voice came from the darkness of the kitchen. Joy's breath hitched, her lungs suddenly feeling like they were filled with lead. Mike stepped into the sliver of moonlight filtering through the window. He looked worse than before, disheveled, vibrating with a manic, caffeine-and-spite-fueled energy. The police had clearly let him out early, or perhaps he had simply stopped caring about the consequences. "Mike, please," Joy whispered, her hands shaking so violently the keys clattered to the floor. "I don't want to fight. Just take what you want and go." "I want what's mine," he hissed, lunging forward before she could even scream. He didn't slap her this time. This wasn't about a momentary flash of temper. This was a systematic reclamation of power. He pinned her against the door, his weight crushing the air from her chest. Joy struggled, her nursing instinct screaming at her to protect her head, to find an exit. She managed to shove him back, her fingernails catching the side of his neck. The scratch ignited something feral in him. He grabbed her left arm, the one already tender from the diner, and twisted it behind her back with a sickening degree of force. Joy's scream was cut short as he slammed her face first into the wall. You think you're better than me now? Because of that Chinaman in the suit? He leaned into her, his breath hot and smelling of cheap cigarettes and resentment. Let's see how well you can wait tables with this. He jerked her arm upward. A sharp, dry crack echoed through the small apartment, the sound of a dry branch snapping in winter. The pain was unlike anything Joy had ever experienced. It wasn't a dull ache, it was a white-hot explosion that blinded her, turning the world into a blur of static and agony. She collapsed to the floor as Mike released her, her arm hanging at an unnatural, sickening angle. He looked down at her, the adrenaline leaving his face and being replaced by a cold, hollow indifference. Now we're even, he muttered, stepping over her crumpled form and disappearing out the door, leaving it swinging wide to the dark hallway. Joy lay on the cold linoleum, her vision swimming. The pain was a physical weight, dragging her toward unconsciousness, but the fear kept her anchored. She knew he'd come back. Or someone else would. She was broken, literally and figuratively, and the sanctuary of her life had been demolished. With trembling fingers, she reached for her phone, which had fallen near the door. Her blurred vision landed on a number she had memorized but never dared to dial, the number Bobby had scribbled on the back of a receipt days ago. The phone rang once. Twice. Yes? The voice was calm, deep, and immediately recognizable. Joy's voice was a broken thread, a sob catching in her throat as the room began to spin. Bobby. She gasped, tears finally spilling over. He broke it. My arm. I have nowhere else to go. There was a pause on the other end, a silence so heavy it felt like the calm before a massacre. Where are you, Joy? Home, she choked out. Please, can you come get me? Stay on the floor, Bobby commanded, his voice no longer a drawl, but a sharp, cold blade. Don't hang up. My men are 3 minutes away. I am 5. You're safe now, Joy. I promise. The transition from the cold, blood-stained linoleum of her apartment to the silk sheets of the penthouse was a blur of trauma and morphine-induced fog. When Joy finally opened her eyes, the first thing she noticed was the silence. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of her apartment, but a soft, expensive quiet that felt insulated from the rest of the world. High above the city, the morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling glass walls, casting long, sharp shadows across a room that was larger than her entire flat. She tried to sit up, but a sharp spike of pain in her left arm anchored her back to the pillows. She looked down to find her arm encased in a pristine white cast and a medical sling, her skin pale against the charcoal-colored bedding. The memory of the snap flashed through her mind, the sound of her life breaking in two, and a fresh wave of nausea rolled over her. You're awake. The voice came from the far corner of the room. Bobby was seated in a minimalist leather armchair, a tablet in his hand and a cup of black coffee on the low table beside him. He looked different without the suit jacket, his white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and the faint ink of a tattoo peeking from beneath his cuff. He looked less like a businessman and more like a king resting after a conquest. Where am I? Joy's voice was a dry rasp, her throat feeling as though it were lined with sandpaper. My home, Bobby said, rising and walking toward the bed. My private doctor saw to your arm. The fracture was clean, but the soft tissue damage was extensive. You'll need weeks of rest. Joy looked past him toward the door, where 2 men stood like stone statues. They wore dark suits and earpieces, their expressions unreadable and their bodies positioned to block any entrance. It was a fortress. She felt a strange, jarring dissonance. She was safer than she had ever been in her life, yet the sheer scale of the power protecting her was terrifying. I can't stay here, she whispered, her eyes darting back to the glass walls. Mike, he'll look for me. He'll find out where I work, he'll follow me. Mike is no longer a factor you need to concern yourself with, Bobby interrupted, his voice dropping into that deadly, level drawl Joy had heard at the diner. He made the mistake of touching something that belonged under my protection. He won't be coming for you. Not today, not ever. There was an icy finality in his words that made Joy shiver. She wanted to ask what he had done, where Mike was, but the look in Bobby's eyes stopped her. It was a gaze that had seen things she couldn't imagine, a gaze that suggested that while the monster in her house was gone, she had moved into the lair of a much larger predator. He reached out, picking up a glass of water from the nightstand and holding it to her lips. His touch was incredibly gentle, a startling contrast to the lethal energy he radiated. As she drank, Joy looked out through the glass at the city below. The people down there looked like ants, tiny and insignificant. For years, she had been one of them, scuttling through the streets in fear. Now, she was behind the glass, shielded by a man the police feared and the city ignored. The security was absolute, but as she looked at the guards and the high-tech locks on the doors, Joy realized she hadn't just been rescued. She had been relocated to a different world entirely. She was no longer a waitress or a victim, she was a guest, or perhaps a prize, in a gilded cage of glass and steel. And as Bobby's hand lingered near hers, she realized that the price of this safety might be more than she was prepared to pay. Safety felt like a luxury Joy couldn't quite afford to believe in, even as she watched the sun set from the 64th floor. For 3 days, the penthouse had been a silent, climate-controlled paradise. Bobby provided everything, silk robes to replace her torn clothes, gourmet meals she was too anxious to eat, and a team of private nurses who changed her dressings with clinical precision. Yet, every time a shadow moved in the hallway, Joy flinched. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop, knowing that Mike wasn't the type to simply vanish into the night. The blow came not as a physical attack on the penthouse, but as a plume of black smoke rising from the city grid below. Joy was standing by the glass wall, tracing the distant streets, when she saw the flicker of orange. It was miles away, nestled in the neighborhood she called home. Bobby entered the room a moment later, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He didn't have to say a word, the way he gripped his phone told her everything. "It's the diner, isn't it?" Joy whispered, her heart dropping into the pit of her stomach. Bobby hesitated, then nodded. "It was firebombed 20 minutes ago. The accelerant was professional grade. It went up in minutes." Joy's breath hitched. Margie's diner wasn't just a place of work, it was her lifeblood. It was the tuition for her nursing exams, the grocery money for her mother, and the only place where she felt like more than just a victim. In one calculated move, Mike, or whoever he had crawled to for help, had burned her bridge back to normalcy. "Charlie," she gasped, her mind racing to the graying manager who had always treated her like a daughter. "He's out," Bobby said, stepping closer. "Minor smoke inhalation, but he's alive. My men were there, Joy. They pulled him out. But the building is a total loss." Joy sank into the leather sofa, her good hand shaking as she pressed it against her forehead. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Mike knew he couldn't get past Bobby's guards, so he was destroying her world from the outside in. He was stripping away her independence, ensuring that if she ever left this penthouse, she would have nothing to return to. "He's trying to draw me out," she said, her voice hollow. "He knows I'll go to Charlie. He knows I'll try to help." "I know," Bobby replied. He sat beside her, the scent of his expensive cologne a sharp contrast to the imaginary smell of smoke filling Joy's lungs. "And that is exactly why you aren't leaving this building." "He's desperate, Joy. He's reached out to people he shouldn't have, small-time hitters looking to make a name by poking a hole in my territory. Joy looked at him, seeing the way his jaw tightened. This was no longer just a domestic dispute, it was becoming a war. Mike had crossed a line, turning a personal vendetta into a challenge against Bobby's authority. "Everything I worked for is gone," Joy murmured, the reality of her situation settling in like lead. "My books, my savings in the locker, my schedule. I have nothing left, Bobby." Bobby reached out, his hand covering hers. His skin was warm, his grip firm. "You have me," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that promised both protection and a terrifying level of debt. The diner was just wood and glass. "I can rebuild 1,000 diners. But I cannot replace you." Joy looked out the window again. The orange glow in the distance was fading, replaced by the harsh, flickering blue of emergency lights. She was safe in her tower of glass, but the world she knew was turning to ash. Mike had fired the first shot in a new kind of battle, and as she looked into Bobby's dark, unwavering eyes, she realized that the man who had saved her was now the only thing standing between her and total annihilation. The independent life she had struggled to build was gone, replaced by a silver-lined dependency that felt increasingly like a permanent choice. The smell of smoke seemed to linger in Joy's senses even though the penthouse air was scrubbed clean and flavored with the scent of expensive lilies. She sat on the edge of the sprawling bed, her fingers tracing the rough texture of her cast, watching the city lights flicker like distant, indifferent stars. The destruction of the diner had been a message, but the silence that followed was even more deafening. Bobby had spent the evening in his study, the muffled sounds of low, urgent Korean phone calls bleeding through the heavy oak doors. He was a man preparing for a hunt, and Joy was the prize being guarded in the high tower. A sharp, digital chime broke the stillness. Joy's personal phone, which she had kept plugged in on the nightstand, vibrated with an incoming message. Her heart skipped a beat. It was an unknown number. Her hand shook as she reached for it, her thumb hovering over the screen. Part of her wanted to scream for Bobby, but another part, the part that had been conditioned by years of Mike's psychological games, compelled her to look. The screen illuminated her pale face, casting a ghostly blue glow over her dark hair. It was a photo. The breath left Joy's lungs in a silent, agonizing rush. The image was grainy, taken in a dimly lit space that looked like a basement or a garage. In the center of the frame, tied to a rusted metal chair, was her younger brother, Leo. His eyes were wide with a terror that shattered Joy's soul, a strip of heavy duct tape pulled tight across his mouth. Behind him, partially obscured by the shadows, stood a figure holding a serrated knife. Even with the face blurred, Joy recognized the jagged, aggressive stance. It was Mike. Beneath the photo, a single line of text appeared, "The fire was just a spark. Come to the old shipyard warehouse alone in 1 hour, or the kid stops breathing. Tell your boyfriend in the suit, and I'll send him his head in a box." A choked, guttural sob escaped Joy's throat. She collapsed onto the floor, the phone clattering against the hardwood. The terrifying security Bobby had promised felt like paper in the face of this. She had thought she was the only target, that her suffering would be the end of it. But Mike had found the one thread of her life he could pull to unravel her completely. Leo was a straight-A student, a kid who spent his weekends playing soccer and dreaming of college. He was innocent. Joy? The door opened, and Bobby stepped in, his sharp eyes immediately cataloging her collapsed form and the discarded phone. He moved with a sudden, predatory speed, reaching her in 2 long strides. He didn't ask, he picked up the phone and looked at the screen. Joy watched his face. She expected shock, or perhaps a flicker of the same paralyzing fear that was currently stopping her heart. Instead, Bobby's expression went unnervingly flat. His eyes turned into chips of black ice, and a muscle in his jaw throbbed with a rhythmic, lethal cadence. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "I have to go," Joy gasped, clutching at his sleeve with her good hand. "Bobby, please, he'll kill him. I have to go alone," he said. He said what he was told to say by desperate men, Bobby interrupted, his voice a low, vibrating hum of pure menace. He knelt in front of her, his hands gripping her shoulders with a firm, grounding pressure. "Listen to me, Joy. If you go there alone, he kills you both. That is the only outcome Mike is capable of imagining." "But he has Leo," she screamed, her voice cracking. "He's just a boy." "And I have an army," Bobby replied, his gaze locking onto hers with such intensity that it forced her to breathe. He stood up, pulling her with him, his presence suddenly filling the entire room. He didn't look like a protector anymore, he looked like a god of war. He tapped a button on his earpiece, his voice switching back to a rapid, commanding string of Korean. He looked back at Joy, his hand reaching out to brush a stray tear from her cheek. "We are going to get your brother. But we are doing it my way. Mike wanted a war? I'm going to give him an apocalypse." The penthouse, once a sanctuary of glass and silence, transformed into a tactical command center within minutes. Men in dark, heavy tactical gear moved through the living room with practiced, silent efficiency, checking suppressed weapons and adjusting comms. The air was thick with the scent of gun oil and the cold, vibrating energy of a looming strike. Bobby stood in the center of it all, a dark tactical vest cinched over his black shirt, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He was no longer the man who sipped coffee at a diner, he was a general preparing to raze an enemy to the ground. "The perimeter is set," one of the men reported, his voice low. "We move in 5. Bobby nodded, his eyes scanning a digital blueprint of the shipyard warehouse. "No survivors except the boy and the husband. I want Mike alive. For a little while." Joy stood by the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was pale, her left arm still cradled in its sling, but there was a new, sharp clarity in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She watched them prepare for a massacre, and she realized that if she stayed behind, she would spend every second of the next hour dying of anticipation and terror. She knew Mike better than any of these men did. She knew how he cornered his prey, and she knew the layout of the shipyard where he used to drink after his shifts. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice cutting through the low murmur of the room. Bobby didn't even look up from the blueprint. "No. It's a combat zone, Joy. You'll stay here with 4 guards. You'll be safe." "Safe?" Joy stepped into the light, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "Leo is in that warehouse because of me. Mike is there because of me. You're going there to kill, but someone needs to be there to save him. Leo could be hurt. Your men could be hurt." Bobby finally looked at her, his dark eyes narrowing. "That's why I have field medics on the team, Joy. I'm a nursing student, Bobby. I've spent 3 years learning how to stop bleeding and stabilize shock under pressure," she countered, taking a step toward the gear bags. "Your medics are trained for trauma, but I'm trained for care. I know Leo's medical history. I know he's allergic to half the sedatives your guys probably carry. If he's terrified and bleeding, he doesn't need a soldier. He needs me." The room went silent. The tactical team paused, looking between the small, injured woman and their formidable boss. Bobby stared at her for a long beat, searching her face for any sign of the learned helplessness he had first seen at the diner. He found none. He saw a woman who had been broken and had decided to forge herself into something sharper. Without a word, Bobby reached into a heavy black crate and pulled out a lightweight Kevlar vest. He walked over to her, his movements slow and deliberate. With his own hands, he slid the vest over her head, cinching the Velcro straps tight against her chest. The weight of it was immense, a physical reminder of the stakes. "If you go, you stay in the armored transport until I give the signal," Bobby said, his voice a low warning. "You do exactly what my lead guard says. If a single bullet flies near you, I will pull you out myself." "I understand," Joy whispered. She turned to a medical bag on the table, beginning to pack it with a cold, professional focus. She grabbed trauma shears, hemostatic gauze, and saline. She was no longer just a victim waiting for a rescue, she was a provider, a healer preparing to enter a war zone. As she slung the medical kit over her shoulder, her good hand gripped the strap tight. "Let's go," Bobby commanded. The elevator doors opened, and the group moved as one toward the garage. Joy walked in the center of the formation, the lady in the sling now encased in armor, her fear transformed into a singular, burning vow: she would bring her brother home, and she would never let Mike make her feel small again. The shipyard was a skeletal landscape of rusted cranes and rotting timber, swallowed by a thick, salty fog that muffled the sound of the approaching black SUVs. Joy sat in the back of the lead vehicle, her good hand white-knuckled around the strap of her medical bag. Beside her, Bobby was a shadow among shadows, his eyes fixed on the thermal imaging tablet in his lap. The warehouse ahead glowed with heat signatures, telltale signs of the trap Mike had set. "Go," Bobby whispered into his comms. The night exploded. It wasn't the chaotic shouting Joy expected, but a series of synchronized, muffled thwips as Bobby's team took out the exterior lookouts. Then came the thunder, the heavy, rhythmic boom of a breaching charge blowing the warehouse's main doors off their hinges. "Stay," Bobby commanded, his hand briefly squeezing Joy's shoulder before he vanished into the smoke, weapon drawn. Joy watched through the reinforced glass as the warehouse swallowed the men. Muzzle flashes flickered like strobes behind the corrugated metal walls. The air soon filled with the sharp, acrid scent of cordite and the distant, panicked screams of Mike's hired thugs. It was a symphony of violence that Joy had only ever seen in movies, but the stakes here were her brother's heartbeat. Minutes felt like hours. Suddenly, the radio in the SUV crackled with a frantic voice. "Medic! We have a man down in Sector B. Heavy arterial spray. We're pinned." Before the guard in the driver's seat could protest, Joy was moving. The learned helplessness that had defined her marriage was gone, replaced by the clinical urgency of a nursing student. She kicked the door open and hit the ground running, her boots splashing through oily puddles. Bullets whistled overhead, snapping against the shipping containers like angry hornets, but Joy didn't flinch. She saw the man, Bobby's right-hand guard, the one who had stood like a statue at the penthouse door, slumped against a crate, blood drenching his tactical vest. "Joy! Get back!" Bobby's voice roared from across the floor, but she ignored him. She slid into the grime beside the fallen guard, her knees hitting the concrete with a jar. The man's face was ashen, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. A stray round had caught him just below the collarbone, severing the subclavian artery. The blood was dark and pulsing, a death sentence if not stopped in seconds. "Cover me!" Joy screamed, her voice surprisingly steady over the din of gunfire. She ripped open her trauma kit. With her one good hand and her teeth, she tore into a pack of hemostatic gauze. The shooter, hidden somewhere in the rafters, redirected his fire toward her. Bullets chewed up the wooden crate inches from her head, showering her dark hair with splinters. Bobby and his team returned fire with a deafening ferocity, creating a wall of lead between her and the gunman. Joy didn't look up. She focused entirely on the wound, her fingers working with a precision that transcended her own pain. She packed the gauze deep into the track of the bullet, her hand disappearing into the warmth of the man's chest. She leaned her entire body weight onto the wound to create pressure. "Stay with me," she hissed at the guard, whose eyes were rolling back. "Look at me. Don't you dare close your eyes." Slowly, the heavy pulsing slowed to a trickle. The gauze was holding. Bobby appeared beside her, his face streaked with soot and blood that wasn't his. He looked at the guard, then at Joy, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and profound respect. He realized then that she wasn't just a lady in a sling to be protected, she was a warrior of a different kind. "He's stable for now," Joy gasped, her face splattered with blood, her eyes burning with a fierce, newfound power. "Where's Leo?" Bobby reached down, grabbing her hand to pull her up. "He's safe. We have him. And we have Mike." Joy stood, her white cast now stained a deep crimson. She didn't feel like a victim anymore. As the gunfire died down to sporadic pops, she realized she had survived the docks of fire. She had walked through the inferno and come out not as a patient, but as a savior. The heavy, industrial air of the warehouse began to settle as the last echoes of gunfire faded into the rhythmic lapping of the harbor waves against the pier. In the center of the loading bay, beneath a single flickering halogen light, Mike was on his knees. His face was a map of bruises and sweat, his once menacing swagger replaced by a frantic, animalistic trembling. He was surrounded by Bobby's men, their rifles held at low ready, a circle of steel that left no room for escape. Joy stepped forward, her boots crunching on the glass and brass shell casings that littered the floor. Beside her, Bobby moved like a shadow, his hand hovering near the small of her back, not to lead her, but to support her. The crimson blood on Joy's cast had begun to dry, a dark badge of the life she had just saved. Mike looked up, his eyes darting from the barrel of a gun to Joy's face. For a moment, he tried to summon the old venom, the sneer that had kept her prisoner for years. "Joy," he rasped, his voice cracking. Tell them I'm your husband. You can't let them do this. We're family, remember?" Joy stopped 3 feet away from him. She looked down at the man who had occupied every corner of her nightmares, the man who had broken her bones and tried to burn her world to the ground. She expected to feel a surge of white-hot rage or a paralyzing wave of fear. Instead, she felt a profound, hollow sense of pity. Without the darkness of their apartment to hide in, without the silence of her shame to give him strength, Mike looked small. He looked like a frightened child playing a part he didn't understand. The idol of the monster she had built in her mind was falling, crumbling into the dirt of the warehouse floor. "Family doesn't break family, Mike," Joy said, her voice low and remarkably steady. It didn't tremble. It didn't plead. It was the voice of a woman who had seen the bottom of the abyss and climbed out. I was angry, Joy. You know how I get," Mike blubbered, reaching out a hand toward her hem. A guard stepped forward, the muzzle of a rifle pressing against Mike's forehead, and he flinched back with a pathetic whimper. "Please. Don't let him kill me. I'll go away. I'll never see you again. Just tell him to let me go." Joy looked at Bobby. The Mafia boss didn't move, he was a statue of ice, waiting for her word. The power to end Mike's life was sitting in the palm of her hand, a single nod away. She realized then that killing him wouldn't be the final act of her liberation. Letting him live in the irrelevance of his own failure was. She looked back at Mike. He was staring at her, waiting for the blow, waiting for the scream, waiting for any sign that he still occupied a space in her heart, even a space filled with hate. "You spent so much time trying to make me afraid, Mike," she said, and a small, sad smile touched her lips. "You wanted to be the biggest thing in my life. But look at you." She gestured to the vast, empty warehouse and the powerful men who didn't even see him as a threat, only a nuisance. "You're not a monster. You're not even a man. You're just a memory I'm done having." "Joy, please." "Goodbye, Mike," she interrupted, her voice turning cold as the harbor wind. "You're already a ghost. I stopped seeing you miles ago." She turned her back on him, not waiting for a response, not needing to hear his pleas. She walked toward the armored transport where Leo was waiting, wrapped in a blanket and safe. Behind her, Bobby gave a sharp, silent signal to his men. They wouldn't kill him, they would deliver him to the authorities with enough evidence of arson, kidnapping, and assault to bury him for decades. But as far as Joy was concerned, the man named Mike had ceased to exist the moment she turned around. She walked into the light of the bay doors, leaving the darkness exactly where it belonged. 6 months later, the morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of a brand-new building on the corner of 5th and Main. The air didn't smell like grease and stale coffee anymore, it smelled of fresh cedar, expensive roast, and new beginnings. Margie's diner had risen from the ashes, rebuilt not just as a workplace, but as a landmark of the neighborhood's resilience. It was the same location, but everything about it had been elevated, from the polished marble counters to the state-of-the-art kitchen where Charlie now hummed a tune, looking 10 years younger than he had the night of the fire. Joy stood by the window, adjusting the strap of her bag. Her left arm was completely free of the brace, the bone knit back together stronger than it had been before. On the table in front of her sat a heavy envelope embossed with the seal of the city's top medical university. "You're going to be late for your first lecture if you keep staring at it," a familiar, low voice drawled from the entrance. Joy turned to see Bobby Ronald leaning against the doorframe. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him like a second skin, his dark hair perfectly styled, his presence still commanding the space with effortless authority. The diner was full, the morning rush was in full swing, but as always, the crowd seemed to subconsciously part for him, creating a private bubble of calm around them. "I still can't believe it," Joy whispered, tapping the envelope. "A full scholarship. The dean said a private foundation was moved by my fieldwork during the shipyard incident. I didn't know the Mafia had foundations." Bobby stepped closer, a rare, genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I told you, Joy. I have influence. And I find that investing in the future of a talented doctor is much more profitable than paying for more guards." Joy laughed, a sound that was no longer brittle or forced. She looked around the diner, seeing the regulars who had returned, the children eating pancakes, and the peaceful hustle of a life she had once thought was lost forever. She was no longer the girl hiding bruises behind a counter, she was a woman whose hands were destined to heal. "You gave me back my life, Bobby," she said softly, stepping into his space. "Actually, you gave me a better one." Bobby reached out, his hand sliding around her waist to pull her close. The protective, predatory edge he usually carried seemed to soften as he looked at her. He wasn't just her savior anymore, he was her partner, the man who had seen her at her weakest and helped her find her greatest strength. "You gave yourself this life, Joy," he replied, his voice a warm vibration against her temple. "I just provided the light so you could see the way. You're the one who walked out of the dark." Joy leaned her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes. For the first time in years, the prickle of dread was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, grounded sense of belonging. The city outside was still loud and dangerous, and the man holding her still moved in shadows she didn't fully understand, but inside the walls of the rebuilt diner, there was only peace. The bell above the door jingled, a bright, cheerful sound that no longer signaled a threat. Joy felt Bobby's arms tighten around her, a fortress of silk and steel that she knew would never let her fall again. She was a healer, she was a student, and she was loved. The snap of the bone had been the end of one story, but as the sunlight warmed her skin, Joy knew it was only the prologue to the one she was writing now. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share it with those you love so they too can hear this meaningful tale. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the emotional stories we bring you every day. We sincerely thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. Wishing you and your loved ones abundant health, joyful lives, and hearts always full of love. Goodbye.